Good Erev Pesach. We're going to give a class today on the four sons, one of my longest running classes. I think you'll enjoy it very much. The first thing to know when we talk about the four sons in the Haggadah is that the Haggadah opens up and it says the Torah speaks of four sons. A lot of people think that means like the oral Torah or metaphorically or this or that. It's just not true. When it says the Torah speaks, it means literally written in the Torah. There are four passages about sons. The only catch that a lot of people who read the Torah frequently have is that the names wise, wicked, simple, and doesn't know how to ask don't actually appear there. And that's why the Haggadah says in the beginning that one of them is wise, one of them is wicked, one of them is simple, and one of them doesn't know how to ask. That repeating of the word one is meant to say that these four sons are not obvious. This is not an obvious list. There are insights, what we call chidushim or a chiddush, in thought, why they are who they are. I mean, they're not so obvious that the wise son is wise, etc., etc. And so we have to sort of figure out who they are. I hope to be able to upload this if YouTube allows, and that you'll have the worksheets. But if you need to look up these sons, we'll call them son 1, 2, 3, and 4. Son 1 is Exodus 12, 25 through 27. Son 2 is Exodus 13, 3 through 8. Son 3 is Exodus 13, 14. And son 4 is Exodus 6 through verse 20 through about 25, I think, if I remember correctly. My worksheet's actually written incorrectly. But in any case, the point is like this. Who are these sons? I mean, can you independently study them and figure out who they are? Some groups can do it in a few minutes. Some I've seen take 15, 20 minutes to figure it out. But the bottom line is that the trick to figuring them out is looking at the question alone and comparing the question to the son in the Haggadah, and then you're able to figure out three of them easily and the fourth by default. What makes it hard is the answer for the wise son is not the same as son 4, who is the wise son. And the answer for the wicked son in son 1 is coming from son 2. And the answer for the simple son works out perfectly, question and answer. And the son who doesn't know how to ask, although the answer is clearly the son who doesn't know how to ask, it's the same quote as the end of the wicked son, which makes it a little bit confusing. And there is nothing that he asks, but that's because he's the son who doesn't know how to ask. And that makes that one easy in that sense. But in any case, when we're all said and done, there are a number of questions that we can ask. And one is, in the Haggadah, what is the difference between the wise son and the wicked son in their question? You could ask the same about in the Torah. What's the difference between them? You know, they both say you. And so the wicked son is wicked because he says you. And even if you want to say the wise son deserves to be called wise because he mentions God, the simple son does not mention God, but he mentions God, and he also says you, and the word in Hebrew is a you that implies like a sense of with. He's together with you. And he knows the categories of commandments, which makes him very important. He knows the testimonies, which we'll come back to in a minute, the judgments, the rational commandments based on sound judgment, like don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. He knows the testimonies that we're rational within the system, meaning if you believe we left Egypt, well, then you want a holiday to commemorate it. And finally, there are the chukim, which I call the ordinances on my worksheet, but most people usually call the statutes. I don't really care which word you use. Those are the commandments that are not irrational against reason. They are not irrational without any reason, or some people would call them non-rational without a reason, which is not irrational, mind you. It's just without a reason. And then they even, what they really are is super rational. They're beyond reason, meaning we can't possibly expect to understand them. And yet we try and figure out as best we can what they mean as the other two categories and why we keep them. Not because that we're looking for the real reason, but because we're looking for something to help motivate us to keep the commandments more. And that's why he's the wise son. He says, what are these commandments in these three different types of categories that God commanded you, meaning us? You know, what is the fact? By the way, they do point out that the wise son, when he says you, his you is not negative because he juxtaposes it to God commanded. And the only reason he's using you is his wisdom, because he recognizes he gets them from his father. That's honor. Okay, so that he's a wise kid, but wise meaning in a good sense. But, you know, the wise son is not that far from the wicked son. He's juxtaposed to him. And there is a problem with the wise son. What do I mean? You know, the wicked son, his problem is he's wicked. The simple son, his problem is that he's simple. The son who doesn't know how to ask, his problem is that he doesn't know how to ask. And the wise son, his problem is that he is wise. wise is one step away from being a wise Alec, like the wicked son. Meaning, if he doesn't, study with the attitude that he wants to keep the commandments and he's only looking for the reasons, that could lead to him rebelling against them if he doesn't understand them. So that's what I meant. He's like one step away. In the meantime, he's quite observant, perhaps, but he counts too much on his own wisdom, and it could lead him away if he's not careful. Now, in any case, what we have to ask ourselves is that when we look at the wise son in the Haggadah, why is his answer different from son 4? And for that matter, why is the answer of the wicked son different in the Haggadah from son 1? And instead, it chooses son 2, plus some other words as well. What's going on over here? So, you could joke and say, well, maybe the rabbi who wrote the author of the Haggadah was not an Orthodox rabbi. I mean, Orthodox usually means if you're told in scenario A, do B, or in scenario X, do Y, and then you don't do B or Y, well, then that's not Orthodox. So what's going on over here? The Haggadah is following a rule that if I wrote it today, someone would probably run me out of town. And we have to try and figure this out. So what it seems is the following. It seems that there's one word, both in the wise son and the wicked son, which has no real meaning out of context of the Haggadah when you're reading the Haggadah. Or in context, I should say. There's no real meaning to this word in context. And that is the word even. The father of the wise son is told, you must even say to him. And the father of the wicked son is told, you must even blunt his teeth, whatever that means. We'll come back to that later. What's even? Even means, well, besides A, tell B. Well, what is, A, that I'm just telling B, this is what's in the Haggadah. Even say this, what was the other thing? Well, the answer seems to be that, the answer that you're supposed to tell the wise son before you tell him about no dessert after the afikomen. No afikomen, no dessert after the Passover sacrifice, is that you have to first give the answer in son 4 in Deuteronomy. And the same for the wicked son. Before you tell him about, you and not him, etc., and blunt his teeth and all those things, had you been there, you wouldn't have got out. The first thing you have to do is give him the answer that the Torah gives to son 1, which is written over there. And we'll talk about that more later. But let's go back to the wise son. And instead of talking about his answer in the Torah, which we'll also talk about that later, let's see if we can understand what in the world are we answering him when we say, tell him that, after the Passover sacrifice, there's no dessert. Well, who cares, really? It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment, I understand. But in context of all the important things to tell him on Seder, what he's doing. So some people say, well, that's the last law of the Seder. So, it's as if you said, tell A to Z. It would be nice if it said that. But that is an acceptable answer, and it's in the sources. So we're not making fun of it. It could have been clearer, that's all I'm saying. But it seems to me, as I was taught, that the idea is like this. The wise son is asking, as we said, about the 3 different types of commandments and how well we understand them so he can learn all the reasons. Reasons for commandments are called ta'amei ha-mitzvot, the taste of the commandment. Why? Because the real reason to eat is to stay alive. But people eat mostly, at least if they're not starving, because it tastes good. And the real reason to keep the commandments is God said so. How about that? But what people get motivated day in and day out for is, how does it affect me? What's it do for me? And you really need both. Okay, but the danger is if you put too much emphasis, whatever too much means, on the taste of the commandment, instead of recognizing that you have to follow the fact that God said so. And when that happens, you compare it now to the following point. The Passover sacrifice is made out of meat that had to be roasted. Roasted meat is considered one of the most tasty dishes to have. On a menu, you have more meat than fish and chicken usually in a restaurant. And I can't say I've ever seen boiled meat on a restaurant menu. Not so normal. The tastiest foods, barbecued, roasted, something like that. Roughly the same type of idea. It seals in the juices and keeps the meat delicious. So how much do you like roasted meat? Well, unless you're vegetarian, quite a lot. That's the case. But the fact remains is that the Passover sacrifice was eaten at the end of the meal, after you wash and ate, 3 helpings of large amounts of matzah, and besides any table matzah that you might have eaten, and, maybe large piece of gefilte fish, and, chicken soup with, one of those matzah balls. And not only that, it had brisket of beef, maybe chicken, potato kugel, some type of, side dish and made out of, maybe simmis out of carrots and raisins and things like that. And, maybe some salad and something else as well. I mean, who knows? And then you had dessert. Now, after all of that, let me ask you a question. If they brought out roasted lamb, how much would you want it? Now, you're not supposed to stuff yourself so when the roasted lamb comes that you're disgusted by it. But the fact remains, it just is not going to taste as good as it would 45 minutes ago before you had anything to eat. Just won't. It'll probably barely taste at all. You have no desire to eat it, and you're going to eat it because it's a commandment. And when it's over, no dessert. You can't be left with chocolate mousse with a taste in your mouth. It's not allowed. You're going to have that taste of, I had to do it because I was told to. I had to eat it because that was the rule, even if it didn't taste good in my mind or in my mouth. And that's what we're telling the wise son. If you want to know the reason behind all the commandments, just be careful that you don't get into the reasons so much in a way that you forget they're God's commandments and you have to do them just because he said so. They must be good for you because he said so, good in this world, good in the next world, or both. You just have to listen. That's the end of it. And what we're really saying also, if you think about it, is even if you have a commandment that's very tasty, quote unquote, one that you really understand, like don't murder, for instance, there are going to be times when you get to the end of, this is a mixed metaphor, see if you can follow it, when you get to the meal of the end of the meal of your understanding, just like the Passover sacrifice doesn't taste good at the end of the meal, sometimes mitzvahs, when you push them to their extreme, the reason is hard to swallow, pun intended. Like, what about when someone's sick and old and in pain and they want you to kill them? Can't do it. It's very difficult. I hope I'm never in that situation. It's very, very hard to do. The merciful thing to do is to, but we're not allowed. It's just the way it is. Even the rational commandments have elements of the Passover sacrifice at the end of the meal. And we still have to keep them. They're still the right thing to do, and they're still good for us. In any case, if we understand this, we now can understand one of my favorite questions in this whole class. There's one other that's new to me, but we'll talk about it later with the help of the one above. And that is that, when you look at the answer that's in the son 4, the wise son, in the end of Deuteronomy chapter 6, 20 through 25, he asks about 3 types of commandments: testimonies, ordinances, and judgments. But the Father says to him, and God commanded us to do all these, it didn't appear at all in the son's question, all these ordinances. It doesn't mention the testimonies and the judgments. And why did it say all these? Just say the ordinances. The answer is there's an aspect, as we said in the metaphor about the Passover sacrifice at the end of the meal, there's an aspect that's absolutely fascinating. And that is all of these commandments have to be treated as ordinances to some degree. And you do them because God said so. And it shows reverence for him. And by the way, it's good for us, he says. Take a look at that verse. It's absolutely amazing. Because basically, it's kind of the dry version of do it because God said so. That the sort of sweet and wet version, if you want to call it that, in the Haggadah about no dessert after the Passover sacrifice, it's the same thing. Oh, what a surprise. When the sages of the Haggadah, who were people who go back to the Jerusalem Talmud, made a remark, they were explaining the Torah. They weren't making things up, God forbid. They're not allowed to do that. I'm not barring that they're making a rabbinic decree or something like that. Their remarks are to explain things. So although they were saying something additional, and we said even say this, nevertheless, the additional point was just a further explanation of what the original said. I don't know about you, but I saw that. I thought that was amazing. Absolutely amazing. Okay, let's move on to the wicked son. The wicked son is very hard to understand. If I would say to you, I'll just make your name Chaim. Hey, Chaim, tell me something. What does Pesach, what does it mean to you? What kind of holiday is it for you? Really, tell me. I'm curious. I want to learn. Would you say I was wicked? I mean, I don't think anybody would. But all the wicked son said was, "What's this service to you? How do you know to call him wicked?" Well, the Haggadah says for him and not for me. I mean, really? Where'd that come from? Doesn't make any sense. I mean, how can you just have an axe to grind against this son just because do you need a wicked one because you had a wise one? I mean, what's going on over here? Well, the answer is quite interesting, but you cannot solve it by reading the wicked son in the Haggadah. The comparison, not surprisingly, has to be made in the 5 books of Moses. Now, the son who doesn't know how to ask doesn't ask a question. But if you look at the narrator's remarks introducing the question in Sons 1, 2, and 3, you'll notice that the simple son and the wise son, I said 1, 2, and 3, I should have said 1, 3, and 4. You'll notice that the simple son and the wise son, the narrator talks about them asking questions. And the son who is supposedly going to be about to be labeled the wicked son, the narrator describes him as saying his question. Now ask yourself, no pun intended, ask yourself, what's the difference between asking a question and saying a question? Think in your mind quickly, before I go on. If you ask a question, how do you ask it? If you say a question, how do you say it? My favorite example is, someone could say, hey, tell me, where was God in the Holocaust? I mean, I don't understand. And someone could say, where was God in the Holocaust? Well, I got news for you. If the person said it the first way, that's a legitimate question. You might be able to help them. If the person said it in the second way, don't even bother trying. He's already telling you he doesn't believe there's a God, and there was no God around in the Holocaust, so why are you going to try and deal with it? There's nothing you can do. The other guy, he believes in God, he doesn't understand. Okay, so you can talk to him. When you say a question, it's a rhetorical question. It's a statement of what you don't believe. Or it could be of what you do believe. But it's a statement if it's different than the other guy. It's not a question at all. And therefore, I would call, he's the smart aleck. He's not smart, but he's the smart aleck. Or, he's the, rejecting the views of his father. What's this service to you? And because he's saying it like that, with that sort of negative edge that he says his question, that's why the Haggadah comments for you and not for him. He says, this is for you. What's the service of yours? But you only know that if you know his tone. By the way, once you know his tone, you can count countless differences between the wise son and the wicked son. But they all depend on really knowing he's a bad guy to begin with. That it says, for him and not for you. That it says sons in the Torah instead of son. Bad people like to travel in packs. He doesn't mention God's name, and therefore, when he talks about service, it's not a good thing like the divine service or godly service. It's just work. It's a pain in the backside. He does not like keeping these commandments. And so there are numerous things that you can see when you study the wicked son. But the key is not in the Haggadah, as I said. The key is looking in Son 1, Exodus 12, 25 to 27, where he says his question. Now, if we go back to the Haggadah, and we see that what it says is that the wicked son, what's this service to you, for you and not for him, because he excluded himself from the community. He's kofar be'ikr. He's denying the essential point of Judaism. Well, in what way is he denying the essential point of Judaism? The essential point of Judaism would be either, mostly, I would say, it means denying God, or it might mean denying the obligation to keep the commandments. Well, we see how he's denying God, I suppose, by the fact that he says, what's his service to you? I mean, does that really make rational sense if he believes in God who commanded the commandments? The reason he feels he can say that, what's it to you, and not to me, is because he doesn't believe in a God who commanded these commandments. And that is called kofar be'ikr. He's denying the essential point of Judaism. But what we do see, what we do also see is it says, the answer to him is, even you, You even have to blunt his teeth. Now, that doesn't mean that you take a hammer and they smash him in the teeth. Blunt his teeth means it's what we would call today in the United States. I'll prove it to you in a second. But it would be like saying, make him choke on his own words. Meaning the following. It was expression in Talmudic times, like a person had the equivalent of like chocolate mousse in his mouth. Maybe in those days that meant like a fig, a nice ripe fig, or a date for that matter, nice and soft and smooth. And he's enjoying it, and all of a sudden, he feels a pebble in his mouth. That's called the thing that was sweet in your mouth is now blunting your teeth. Well, that's what's happening to him. This kid, by saying in the rhetorical, what's this service to you? Right? What he's really saying is that he doesn't believe, but he likes what he says. He's a smart aleck. So we say to him, well, if you are excluding yourself from the community of people who believe in God and believe you have to keep these commandments, let me shock you a little bit. Let me choke on your words. Let me show you where your argument is leading. And your argument is leading to the following point that we say to him. We say to him, you blunt his teeth and say, on account of this, which in context, if you look it up in Son 2, Exodus 13, 3-8, on account of the Passover sacrifice, God acted for me when I left Egypt. Now, what's the point of that? Well, the point of that sentence is, had he been there, if he didn't believe, he wouldn't have made the Passover sacrifice because he would have been afraid to kill the Egyptian god, which the sheep was. As Moses himself said that the Jews would be nervous about that in chapter 8, verse 22 of Exodus, when Paro first said they could leave, and Moses said, we can't go. We can't do it. Paro said they could at least sacrifice to the god in the land of Egypt, correction there. And Moses said, we can't do that because we're going to be sacrificing the god of Egypt. And if we sacrifice the god of Egypt in their eyes, won't they stone us? Well, Moses, whether he meant it or not, I don't know, but for sure, other Jews who were not so believing would have been afraid of being stoned. That's clear. And many didn't want to make the Passover sacrifice, and those that didn't, well, they also didn't put the blood on the doorposts, and God wouldn't have passed over their homes. And so they wouldn't have gotten out. And that's what we say to them. On account of this, right, that God acted for us, doing the mitzvahs that you're denying God that he could help us and protect us when we would do the mitzvah of eating their God, which would be pretty shocking for anybody. Imagine watching someone eat their God. And therefore we say, for me and those like us, and not for him. We don't even talk to him directly. We talk to him indirectly as part of the shock, right? Had he been there, he wouldn't have been redeemed. And that's what we're saying. It's almost feeling, you don't have to say that it's really meaning to be mean. You're trying to rescue him. We're trying to make him choke on it so he comes to his senses. And we're trying to get him to realize he wouldn't have got out. And that doesn't make us very happy. In fact, take a look in Son 1 and back in Exodus 12, 25-27. And we now have the same question, that this answer doesn't match that one. But I think it does. You must say to this child, it's a Passover service to God, meaning he is denying God by he's saying, what's this service to you? So we have to answer him, it's a Passover service to God. It's worth keeping. We didn't make it up. And you continue to say, and he passed over the houses of the Israelites and struck the Egyptians, sparing our homes. Why? Because we made that service. Had you been there, you wouldn't have got out. So it comes out that what we say to the wicked son is almost an exact parallel, maybe heads and tails over here. Not exactly, I'd say the wise son, the passages in the Haggadah and the Torah are heads and heads. This is heads and tails. But it's pretty much the same coin, I think. I think it goes without saying. So we've really answered one of my most favorite questions in the Haggadah, which is how do you, not only are those wise son and wicked son's answers, telling you to look in the Torah with the word even, they're not trying to go against the Torah, but they're not just two different answers. They're one and the same, for crying out loud. Right? And that is an amazing interpretation. And I think it's worth sharing with anybody on the Haggadah. Of course, you got to have a smarter group of people who could understand the idea that, the sages aren't supposed to not only not add, but not even change the message of the Torah. And they're really supposed to stick with it. There can be things we wouldn't have understood, but it's not supposed to be a change. And it's got to somehow be a continuity in Torah. Okay, so the simple son, I don't think there's much to say over there. He's pretty simple. Question simple, answer simple, no extra words added by the sages in the Haggadah. So we're done. All right, but let's take a look at the son who doesn't know how to ask, who's basically son 2. And what we need to see about son 2 is